Every single day, over $7.5 trillion moves through the global financial system. Oil deals, trade agreements, government reserves, corporate transactions, and the overwhelming majority of it, regardless of which countries are involved, is settled in one currency. Not the currency of the world's largest population, not the currency of the world's fastest growing economy, but a piece of paper printed in Washington, D.C., that costs approximately 3.7 cents to produce. And yet, that same piece of paper can determine whether a country eats or starves, whether a government survives or collapses, whether a war gets funded or stops. This is the dollar. And the question nobody asks clearly enough is this: how did a piece of paper get that much power? And more importantly, what happens to the world if it loses it? Before we talk about the dollar specifically, we need to understand something more fundamental. Money has no intrinsic value. This isn't a controversial statement. It's the foundational principle of modern monetary theory. In 1971, economist Milton Friedman made an argument that reshaped how governments think about currency. Money, he argued, is not a store of value in itself. It is a shared agreement, a collective illusion that only functions because everyone participates in it simultaneously. The paper in your wallet is worth something because you believe it is, because the person you hand it to believes it is, because the institution behind it has convinced enough of the world to believe it is. Remove the belief, and the paper is worth exactly what it costs to print it: 3.7 cents. Now here's where it gets interesting. If money is just a shared agreement, then the most powerful currency in the world isn't the one backed by the most gold, or the strongest army, or the largest economy. It's the one that has the most people locked into the agreement. And that's exactly what the dollar did. July 1944. World War II is not yet over, but 44 nations gathered in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods and made a decision that would define the global economy for the next 8 decades. The deal was simple on the surface. Every country would peg its currency to the dollar, and the dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This gave the world something it desperately needed after decades of war and depression: stability, a single reference point, a universal standard, a way to trade across borders without the chaos of fluctuating exchange rates. But embedded inside that deal was something far more significant. By making the dollar the anchor of the entire system, the United States didn't just join the global economy, it became the infrastructure of it. Every transaction, every reserve, every international debt now ran through Washington. And when President Nixon ended the dollar's gold convertibility in 1971, effectively breaking the original Bretton Woods agreement, something remarkable happened. The world kept using the dollar anyway, not because of gold, not because of a treaty, but because by then the dollar wasn't just a currency. It was a habit, a system, a dependency. But habits can break, dependencies can shift. So how did the dollar survive the end of Bretton Woods and actually strengthen its position afterward? The answer is oil. In 1974, the Nixon administration reached a landmark agreement with Saudi Arabia. The terms were straightforward. The United States would provide military protection and weapons to the Saudi government. In return, Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in dollars and invest its surplus oil revenues in U.S. Treasury bonds. This was the birth of the petrodollar system, and its consequences were immediate. Because Saudi Arabia wasn't just any oil producer, it was the dominant force inside OPEC, the organization controlling the majority of the world's oil supply. Within 2 years, every OPEC nation had adopted dollar pricing for oil, and with that single move, the dollar became structurally irreplaceable. because now any country that needed oil, which meant every country on Earth, needed dollars first, not because of military force, not because of economic size, but because the world's most essential commodity was priced in one currency. The dollar had become the toll booth on the highway of global energy. Economist Barry Eichengreen of UC Berkeley describes the dollar's position as an exorbitant privilege, a term originally coined by French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in the 1960s. The privilege is real and measurable. Because the world needs dollars, the United States can borrow at lower interest rates than any other nation. It can run persistent trade deficits without triggering the currency crises that would destroy any other economy. It can impose financial sanctions with devastating effect, because cutting a country off from dollar access is effectively cutting it off from global trade. In 2022, when the US and its allies froze approximately $300 billion of Russia's foreign currency reserves following the invasion of Ukraine, they didn't use military force. They used dollar infrastructure, and it worked. But here's what Eichengreen also argues, and this is the part that gets ignored. The privilege comes with a structural trap. To supply the world with enough dollars to function, the United States must run a permanent trade deficit. It must consistently spend more than it earns globally, exporting dollars in exchange for goods. This is known as the Triffin Dilemma, identified by economist Robert Triffin in 1960. The dollar can either serve American interests or serve global liquidity needs. It cannot fully do both simultaneously. And that tension, built into the system from the beginning, is exactly what's now being exploited. In 2023, something happened that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Brazil and China settled a major trade deal directly in Chinese yuan and Brazilian reais. No dollars involved. It wasn't the size of the transaction that mattered, it was the signal. Because Brazil and China weren't alone. India began settling oil purchases from Russia in rupees. Saudi Arabia publicly discussed accepting yuan for oil. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, began formal discussions about a shared reserve currency. This is de-dollarization, and it's no longer a theoretical concept. But here's where the analysis has to be precise, because the conversation around de-dollarization is frequently distorted in both directions. On one side, analysts who dismiss it entirely, arguing the dollar's dominance is structurally unassailable. On the other, commentators who predict imminent collapse, often with more ideology than evidence. The reality, according to IMF data from 2023, is more nuanced. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from approximately 71% in 2000 to around 58% today. That's a significant drop, but 58% is still more than the next four currencies combined. The dollar isn't collapsing, it's slowly becoming less monopolistic. And that distinction matters enormously, because the transition from monopoly to dominance is where the real instability lives. Most analysts asking, will the dollar be replaced, are asking the wrong question. The more accurate question is this: what happens to the global economy if the dollar system fragments, even partially? Economist Kenneth Rogoff of Harvard argues that the real risk isn't a single alternative currency replacing the dollar. It's the emergence of competing currency blocks, a dollar zone, a yuan zone, perhaps a euro zone, each with its own rules, its own infrastructure, its own logic. In that world, international trade doesn't just get more expensive, it gets more political. Every transaction becomes a geopolitical statement. Every reserve decision becomes an alliance signal. The neutral infrastructure that once allowed global trade to function begins to fracture, and that fracture is already starting. Russian energy being priced in rubles and yuan, Chinese infrastructure loans increasingly denominated in renminbi, and the global payment system itself no longer singular. SWIFT has a parallel now, CIPS. The architecture is being duplicated, not replaced, duplicated. And a world with two financial systems is not a more stable world. It is a more expensive, more fragmented, and more conflict-prone one. Here's the thing most dollar analysis misses entirely. The dollar's dominance isn't just an American story, it's a global condition, one that shapes the behavior of every country that participates in the system. Every country that holds dollar reserves, that prices commodities in dollars, that borrows in dollar-denominated debt, is operating inside a structure it does not control. And for many of those countries, particularly in the developing world, this structure creates a paradox, because the dollar system is simultaneously a source of stability and a source of vulnerability. It provides access to global trade, predictability in pricing, and integration into the international financial system. But at the same time, it exposes entire economies to decisions made thousands of miles away, decisions they have no influence over. When the U.S. Federal Reserve raises interest rates, as it did aggressively between 2022 and 2023, it does so for domestic reasons: inflation control, labor market stability, internal economic pressure. But the consequences don't stay inside the United States. They propagate outward instantly. Dollar-denominated debt becomes more expensive to service. Governments that borrowed in dollars now need more local currency to pay the same obligation. Capital begins to move. Investors pull money out of emerging markets and push it back into dollar assets, seeking higher returns with lower risk. Currencies weaken. Energy prices rise. Food prices follow. Inflation accelerates, not because of domestic policy failure, but because of external monetary gravity. In 2022, Sri Lanka's economy collapsed under a combination of debt pressure and foreign reserve depletion, triggered in part by exactly this dynamic. Pakistan faced a balance of payments crisis, struggling to secure enough dollars to maintain essential imports. Egypt entered another IMF-supported program as currency pressure intensified. Argentina, once again, found itself negotiating with external creditors under conditions largely shaped by global dollar flows. None of these economies collapsed in isolation. They were pulled into instability by a system designed somewhere else. That's the hidden cost of dollar dominance, not just for geopolitical rivals, but for countries that depend on the system to function without having the power to influence it. And this is where the analysis becomes uncomfortable, because the question is no longer whether the system works. It clearly does. The question is who it works for. So here's where the analysis lands. The dollar is not about to collapse, not suddenly, not dramatically, not in the way popular narratives suggest. Anyone claiming an imminent collapse is either misunderstanding the system or selling a simplified version of it. The structural foundations of dollar dominance are still deeply intact. The global payment infrastructure, the pricing conventions of critical commodities like oil, the depth and liquidity of U.S. Treasury markets, and, most importantly, the absence of a fully credible alternative. No other currency currently combines scale, stability, trust, and global integration at the level required to replace the dollar. But replacement was never the real risk. The real shift is happening underneath that assumption. Because what's ending is not the dollar itself, it's the era of uncontested dominance. What's replacing it is something far more complex, organized fragmentation, a slow transition toward a multipolar financial system where multiple currencies coexist, compete, and fragment global liquidity. And that world behaves very differently. It is more expensive because transactions now require conversion across multiple systems. It is less efficient because capital is no longer flowing through a single integrated network. And it is far more political because currency choice becomes a signal of alignment, a statement of allegiance, a geopolitical decision disguised as a financial. The end of dominance is not an overnight collapse. It's a gradual reshaping of the global framework. It's the end of the sole superpower and the emergence of a multifaceted world. The 3.7-cent piece of paper is not losing its value overnight, but the agreement that gave it that value is changing. The shared belief, the institutional trust, the geopolitical alignment that held the system together, that agreement is being renegotiated, quietly, gradually, but in ways that are structurally irreversible. And in a system built on belief, perception matters as much as reality. Markets don't wait for collapse. They react to expectation. They move on signals, on shifts in confidence, on the perception that something fundamental is beginning to change. And the moment enough actors, governments, institutions, investors start behaving as if the system is no longer singular, that behavior itself becomes the transition. Because in the end, the dollar was never just paper, it was an agreement. And like all agreements, it only lasts as long as enough people choose to believe in it.